Most of the complaints were about the lack of food and the danger outside the territories. After looking at it for about 10 minutes, Richard had an idea. It seemed that the food problem was typical and not unusual. Many people mentioned that the system was protected for a time, which made him ponder. If someone didn't step out of the territory for a month, the security period would not drop to 7 days. Was it the same in Richard's territory? If it was the same for everyone, then the choice given by the system might be a turning point. After obtaining a lot of useful information, Richard closed the forum chat. Surfing the internet was too time-consuming. Without hesitation, Richard brought the 14 mummies to the edge of Twilight City. The first-class village was not big, and there were no city walls outside. Every place led to the desert. It was noon. From afar, the yellow sand looked like golden sand under the sun. The heat wave was coming. Richard looked down. The ground of the territory was paved with stones, and a step away, there was yellow sand everywhere. The dividing line was very clear, as if there was a special rule separating the two sides. After careful observation, Richard found a transparent shield in front of the dividing line. The shield was like an upside-down bowl, protecting Twilight City. Richard understood. This was the shield of protection mentioned on the forum chat. He extended his right hand. The moment Richard touched the shield, the system notification sounded. Ding, do you want to leave Twilight City? The shield of protection would provide a month's protection time. After leaving, the shield of protection would break in a week. Note, the shield of protection is a product of the rules. It cannot be broken. If Richard was afraid of death, he could stay in the territory for a whole month without worrying about his safety. But if he left, the time would be shortened to 7 days. It had to be said that this had indeed hit the heart of many people. However, it was also a huge trap. The initial development time was so precious. To enjoy a month of safety here was equivalent to wasting a month. Without hesitation, Richard stepped out of the shield. He did not feel anything when he passed through, as if the shield did not exist. Richard did not care about anything else. He looked at the few resource points marked on the system map and thought to himself. With the information provided by Karu, he could occupy all the resource points around the territory. From the map, these resource points were only 20 minutes away from Twilight City. The logging field is on the west side of Twilight City, less than 10 minutes away. The quarry is in the northwest, about 15 minutes away. The resource points that are suspected to be iron mines are in the northeast, about 20 minutes away. Richard was dumbfounded. Let's start with the nearest logging field. Richard carefully compared the system map and identified the target of the operation. A rustling sound could be heard. With his leather boots, Richard stepped into the yellow sand. Fine sand flowed through the instep. It brought a bit of heat. When Richard raised his foot, the sand fell again and returned to yellow sand. Only irregular footprints were left on the spot. Within a kilometer of Twilight City, the field was flat. There were also rolling sand dunes a kilometer away. The boundless yellow sand could not be seen at a glance. It was simple and desolate. The hot wind mixed with a little sand blew on the face. It could make one's mouth dry. The desert had always been the symbol of the forbidden land of life in the hearts of ordinary people. However, Richard had the talent of a desert lord. Walking in the desert did not give him the slightest bit of pressure. On the contrary, he felt quite relaxed. It was as if a fish had returned to the water. There was no need to mention the mummy. It was as if a fish had returned to the water. There was no need to mention the mummy. Racial talent increases stamina and recovery rate by 50% in the desert. This inaccessible death zone was their home. Richard had 4 mummies scout ahead, and he was protected by 10 mummies. But as soon as he stepped a kilometer out onto the sand dunes, the mummies ahead got excited. They turned their heads and gestured to Richard. What was interesting was that the mummies' mouths were sealed, and they could not speak. They could only tell the information through their limbs. Richard did not delay and immediately climbed up the sand dune with 10 mummies. From a high vantage point, about 400 to 500 meters away, there was a tree-shaded forest growing in the sand. The shadows of the trees swayed and were indescribably green. That lively scene formed a sharp contrast with the desolation of the surrounding desert. Through the branches, one could vaguely see that there seemed to be some wooden buildings inside. Logging field. Level: small. Reserves: 20,000 units. Maximum output: 2,100 units per week. Capacity: minimum of 2 people, maximum of 10 people. Description: ordinary resource points. After occupying it, it can be built into a small logging field. Small-scale logging fields? 20,000 units of reserves? 2,100 units per week? Richard narrowed his eyes slightly. In this way, as long as they occupied this logging field, they could get 300 units of wood every day. He immediately became interested and sped up with the mummies. However, when they approached the logging field, they suddenly heard a terrifying roar coming from inside. Whoosh! Whoosh! Then 20 to 30 figures rushed out from the 5 to 6 meter tall forest. Richard stopped and looked over. These monsters, which suddenly appeared, had heads that were as ferocious as jackals, and their eyes were emitting a terrifying green light. Their bodies were covered with thick gray hair that was as tough as armor. They curved their backs and stood with one hand on the ground. Their sharp claws left scratches on the ground. When they ran forward, they would use both hands. They opened their mouths wide, revealing their sharp canine teeth, and their saliva drew long lines in the air. Desert Gnoll. Level: 1. Potential: normal 2 stars. Skill: brutal F rank. Once it attacks, its anger will swallow its reason, and it will become fearless until it kills the enemy. Race talent: has a keen sense of smell. Fetters: when the number of gnolls is greater than 10, strength increases by 10%. When the number is greater than 20, strength increases by 20% activated. Description: be careful of your throat. The number of gnolls that suddenly appeared exceeded 30, and the fetters that increased strength by 20% were also activated. Their aura was fierce. When Richard saw this scene, he was not afraid, but he became very excited instead. His mummies were elite level 1. Attack. With a wave of his hand, 14 bandaged mummies charged forward. With a wave of his hand, 14 bandaged mummies charged forward. The mummies let out a terrifying roar from their throats. Their open claws could tear through steel. Their aura was bloodthirsty, and their empty eye sockets without eyeballs were extremely terrifying. Their running speed did not slow down because of the bandages all over their bodies. In just a few breaths, the mummy had fought with more than 30 gnolls. Roar! A gnoll pounced on the mummy and directly bit the mummy, wanting to end the undead that terrified them. The mummy used its arm that was wrapped in thick bandages to block the attack and ruthlessly smashed a gnoll's head. A gnoll whimpered and took a few steps back. It almost fell to the ground. However, the bestiality in its blood was completely aroused. With a roar, it rushed forward and bit the mummy's arm with its huge mouth. Then, its head shook crazily, trying to tear the mummy in front of it with its sharp teeth. Body of Death E rank: no fear of pain, no fear of death, and immune to poison, plague. The mummy could not feel pain or fear at all. When the gnoll bit, the mummy's sharp fingers that could tear through steel pierced directly into the gnoll's abdomen. Sharp claw tearing E rank: finger sharpness increased by 30%. Sturdiness increased by 30%. Blood spurted out. The gnoll's blood stained the bandage on the mummy's arm. The gnoll let out a mournful howl. Under the excruciating pain, the skin on its body started to turn faint blue. At the same time, its strength rapidly decreased. Corpse bandage E rank: reduces physical damage by 30%. The bandage carries plague. The infected person will enter a weakened state, and all stats will be reduced by 20%. If they are not treated, they will gradually die. After the gnoll was stabbed by the mummy's sharp fingers, not only did it not stop, but it even pulled hard. The gnoll's abdomen seemed to have been slashed by a razor. It was as if the zipper of a coat had been pulled open. It was a bloody mess. Amidst the intense pain, an extremely brutal gnoll still did not give up on attacking. Its 2 sharp claws were still fiercely attacking the mummy. The bloody smell of the frenzied battle immediately attracted the attention of the surrounding gnolls. The eyes of the monsters that were running suddenly turned scarlet, and they pounced on the mummy. The mummy was held back by the gnolls, and there was no time for it to dodge. It was directly drowned by 7 or 8 gnolls. The bandages on its body kept breaking, and some parts of its shriveled body were revealed. But in this situation where the mummy was certain to die, the gnolls that launched the attack suddenly let out a scream, their bodies suddenly turned a faint blue, and their strength decreased rapidly. They retreated as if they had been electrocuted. The mummy, who had just been surrounded and killed, felt as if its entire body was flowing with yellow sand. Meanwhile, the sharp claws of the gnolls that were attacking the mummy seemed to have pierced into the sand. They could only feel a slight obstruction piercing through their opponent's body. After the gnolls left, the mummy's body returned to its original state. Not only did they not cause any damage to it, but the attacking gnolls were instead infected by the plague, and their physical strength rapidly weakened. Sand transformation, D rank. It reduces 99% of physical damage. It can devour yellow sand to recover from injuries. It can last for 5 minutes. Cooldown time, 2 hours. Without magical damage, within 5 minutes, the mummy standing on the sand would be immortal. The sharp 5 fingers solidified in the sand, tearing apart the 2 gnolls that were still unwilling to bite it. After this scene appeared, the fate of these gnolls was determined. Although the gnolls fought fiercely, the mummies were even more overbearing. Even if the mummy didn't use the sand, it could still suppress the opponent with its mighty strength. After using the sand, the mummy was invincible. One after another, the gnolls were pierced through the heart and had their throats slit by the mummies. The battle only lasted for a minute or 2 before it ended. When the last gnoll fell, the system notification rang out. Ding, your troop has eliminated a group of gnolls and obtained victory in a small-scale battle. You have obtained 34 experience points. Richard, who was supervising the battle from the rear, was in a great mood. This was the combat strength of an elite soldier. Facing an enemy that was several times stronger than their own, they slaughtered all of them without suffering any damage. Richard glanced at his level. Level 134 100ths. His leveling progress had visibly increased by a large margin. The bigger reward was that after exterminating the gnolls, he would be able to occupy this resource point.
After Richard's excitement subsided, he saw that the gnolls' corpses were scattered all over the ground. He frowned slightly. Although the gnolls were monsters in the wild, the blood and limbs that dyed the yellow sand were still very visually and psychologically shocking. This was also the first time that Richard had seen such a horrifying scene. However, he did not avoid it. He gritted his teeth and walked through the blood and corpses that were scattered all over the ground. Sooner or later, there would be a larger-scale conflict in this world. If Richard did not get used to it soon, no one would shelter him from the wind and rain. Step by step, he left the bloody area. Although Richard's face did not look good, there was a strange aura around him. Ding. Do you want to occupy a resource point? Logging field, small? Richard took a deep breath and nodded. Confirmed. Successfully occupied. You have obtained a small-scale resource point. You can send lumberjacks here to cut wood. Hearing the system notification, the slightly pale Richard's mood improved a little. The mummy that was covered in bandages and dyed red entered. The mummy turned his head and looked around. The 5 to 6 meter tall trees covered the sky, and the air suddenly became cool. In the central area, there were 7 to 8 trees that had been cut down. There was also a small wooden house next to it. When Richard pushed the door open, he could see that there were more than 10 rusty axes inside. Not bad. Although I can tell at a glance that it hasn't been used for a long time, as long as I take over it, I can start production immediately. There were many types of resource points in the game Shining Era. Some of them were primitive. For example, if it was a forest, then a logging field would need to be built. However, These types of resource points were usually only found in large-scale resource points. Small-scale resource points could be directly mined. It seemed that the designers had deliberately considered this for beginners. Now, it has saved Richard a lot of trouble. After walking around the logging field and finding nothing else, he did not stay, nor was he in a hurry to go back and get someone to cut the wood. Richard brought the 14 mummies and headed straight for the resource point in the southeast direction. These two resource points were very close to each other. After crossing the two sand dunes, he saw an area with jagged rocks. Quarry, level small. Reserves 10,000 units. Maximum output 1,400 units per week. Capacity minimum of 2 people, maximum of 7 people. Description: normal resource points can be mined after occupation. Compared to small-scale logging fields, the attributes of small-scale quarries had decreased, or 400 units per week. That was 200 units per day. Adding the logging field, that was 500 units per day. Richard's mood improved a little. Not bad, the harvest was not bad. With his experience with the gnolls, he was not in a hurry to get close, so he let the 4 mummies continue to explore the WAs expected. When the mummies approached the quarry, whooshing sounds could be heard. More than 20 stones flew out from the quarry. Following the sound of a bang, the mummies were not able to dodge in time and were directly hit. However, the power of those stones was really too weak. The mummies took a wave of damage, but were completely fine. Ding! Your army has been attacked by a group of unknown enemies. The corner of Richard's mouth twitched. Throwing stones? Wasn't this a little funny? Mummies attack. If the enemy isn't strong, leave a few alive. Using stones to hit people, it was a field army that guarded the small-scale resource points. Richard really could not imagine how powerful the enemy could be. He left 2 mummies to protect him, while the rest were sent out. The distance of dozens of meters was covered in the blink of an eye. The power of the stones thrown by the enemy was weak to begin with, and when they hit the mummies, who ignored the pain of the undead, it was as if nothing had happened. Ah! After the mummies rushed into the quarry, they heard a scream filled with fear, and soon they regained their calm. Ding! Your army defeated a group of long-armed laborers and won a small-scale battle. You have gained 30 experience points. Level 164-100. Richard nodded in satisfaction. As long as he had won the battle, he would be able to level up. The harvest was not bad. Richard walked towards the quarry. When he arrived at the center, a group of ugly creatures with terrifying faces was sitting on the ground. There were 7 or 8 corpses around them. The mummy was standing by the side coldly. These ugly creatures had 4 canine teeth protruding out of their lips, and their faces were very ferocious. Their bodies were almost the same as ordinary humans, but they had a pair of long, sturdy arms that were over the knees. They looked quite sturdy. Long-armed laborers. Level 1. Potential. Normal 1-star. Skills. Endurance E rank. Able to withstand extremely tough working conditions. Racial talent. When food is sufficient, stamina can be recovered quickly. Features. When the number of long-armed laborers is greater than 10, stamina recovery speed increases by 20%. When the number of long-armed laborers is greater than 20, stamina recovery speed increases by 40%. Activated. Description: don't hit them, Lord. They will go to work right away. Good. There was such a strange army. No wonder they were called laborers. The talents of these guys were simply too suitable for work. After Richard appeared, he immediately attracted the attention of the laborers. When they saw the respectful posture of the mummies, they were instantly startled awake. They immediately turned around and knelt down toward him. Pressing their heads against the ground, they shouted excitedly, "Great Lord, we are willing to submit to you. Don't kill us." Ding! A group of long-armed laborers admires your strength after losing the battle and wants to submit to you. Do you want to accept? Was it that simple? Richard laughed. Ads by Pub Future. These guys were indeed suitable to be squeezed dry. They were practically the welfare of capitalists. Accept it. You have obtained 30 long-armed laborers. Ding. Do you wish to occupy the quarry? Occupy it? You have obtained a small-scale quarry. You can send miners to carry out mining. Richard waved his hand and pointed at the first long-armed laborer who knelt down and surrendered. I have appointed you as the person in charge of the quarry. You will be responsible for managing the production of the quarry. At the same time, I will assign 6 laborers to you. You have the right to manage the other laborers. The long-armed laborer was overjoyed and knelt on the ground. Great Lord, I will definitely produce more ores for you. Ding. You have used language to motivate a long-armed laborer. The efficiency of the subordinates under your jurisdiction in mining ores has increased by 20%. Duration, 3 days. This could work? Richard was delighted. Good God, could he send people to encourage him every once in a while in the future? After searching the quarry and finding nothing else, Richard left 7 laborers to mine the stone. At the same time, he appointed a laborer as the head of the quarry and led the other 9 people to work in the quarry that had just been occupied by the treasure. The appointed laborer was also particularly excited and had the characteristic of increasing efficiency by 20%. After this round, not only did they occupy 2 resource points, but they also gathered all the workers. And Richard didn't pay anything. He even had 1 or 3 long-armed laborers in his hands. These gains made Richard very motivated, but after thinking about it, he was a little distressed. Although the laborers are useful, they have 30 more mouths to feed. There are only 3 days of grain left, and it's going to shrink again. He had just opened the trading market to take a look, and there was no food for sale. There were a few scattered items, and the prices were also extremely outrageous. Moreover, they were quickly sold out, so it was difficult to buy them. It seems that logistics will become the key point to restrict the development of the territory in the future. Richard looked at the mummies beside him with lingering fear. Fortunately, they did not need to consume food, or else they would really die. The resource point in the northeast direction was slightly further away. It took about half an hour to get there from the quarry. The speed of the 13 laborers was too slow, which slowed down the marching speed. It was very difficult for these guys to walk in the sand. After climbing over a low sand dune, Richard looked at the mark on the map and saw traces of the 3rd resource point, iron mine. The desert around the iron mine had become dry and hard ground. The oil-black ores piled up together. It looked very conspicuous. Iron mine. Level, small. Reserves, 20,000 units. Maximum output, 2,100 units per week. Capacity, minimum of 5 people, maximum of 10 people. Description: an ordinary iron mine can send miners into it to mine ores. With the previous 2 experiences, Richard did not hesitate and waved his hand. He let the 14 mummies press on. At the same time, the remaining 13 laborers picked up the stones scattered on the ground. This created a formation with warriors at the front and ranged attacks at the back. It was an extremely simple version. When the bandaged mummy approached the iron ore, a piercing sound came from the air. More than 20 arrows pierced through the sky and then through the bandaged mummy's bodies. Ding, you have angered a group of desert bandits.
As undead creatures, mummies only had to worry about their heads. Unless their heads were blown off, they could not be killed. After the 14 mummies were attacked, they let out terrifying growls and sped up. They charged into the iron mine with arrows. When Richard saw this, he immediately ordered 13 laborers to follow. He then waited. As a lord, he naturally had his way of playing. The correct strategy was to sit at the back and command the army to fight. Leading the charge was a little too stupid. Wouldn't it be a waste to be killed by the enemy's concentrated fire? With so many mummies that were stronger than him around, he did not lack combat strength even if he did not even have weapons. Although the iron mine was not high, the complicated terrain still blocked his view. Richard could not see the specific situation of the battle. However, it was not too difficult for the 14 elite level 1 mummies and 13 long-armed laborers to attack a small-scale resource point together. A few minutes later, the sound of the system's upgrade rang out. Ding, the army you led annihilated a group of desert bandits and obtained victory in a small-scale battle. You have gained 36 experience points, and your level has increased. Thereafter, Richard felt a warm current rising from all over his body as if he was soaked in hot water and needed by a specialist. He could sharply feel his muscles and bones absorbing the warm current. After a moment, the warm current disappeared. Richard felt that his body was filled with an indescribable power as if he could kill a calf with a single punch. He clenched his fist and made cracking sounds. Is this leveling up? Isn't this awesome? It's even superior to a 5,000-hour massage from a specialist. Ding, do you want to occupy the iron mine? Occupy it. After Richard made his choice, he was in a great mood. He stepped on the dry and hard ground and entered the iron mine. These desert bandits were covered in scars left by the mummy's sharp claws. Their flesh and blood were rolling around, making them look rather terrifying. Richard frowned slightly. He still felt a little uncomfortable about this. However, compared to when he had just killed the gnolls, his psychological endurance had increased by a lot. Step by step, he stepped into the center of the iron mine. Seeing Richard appear, the mummy and the laborers immediately surrounded him. Great Lord! These damn desert bandits have all been killed. Your light has already enveloped this iron mine. The mummy could not speak, but the long-armed laborers were still very happy to show off their achievements in front of their new lord. Richard nodded slightly. Just as he was about to speak, another long-armed laborer ran over from the side excitedly. Lord, I found a treasure chest. Praise the goddess of luck. Treasure chest? Richard's eyes immediately lit up. In the game's shining era, there was a chance to obtain all sorts of materials and treasures by hunting down soldiers in the wild. The treasure chest was one of them. All sorts of treasures could be obtained from it. Bring me there. The laborer immediately led the way excitedly. After a few twists and turns, the laborer stopped in a narrow stone crack. Richard focused his gaze and saw a wooden box emitting a bronze light. Wooden box level, 1-star status, unlocked description, maybe you can get some junk from it. Wow, this description is truly not polite. The lowest level of the treasure box was 1 star, and the highest was 5 stars. The higher the level, the higher the chance of obtaining a precious treasure. However, this description naturally eliminated the possibility of obtaining a good item. That's right. How good could an item that was guarded by a group of ordinary level desert bandits be? Richard didn't have many expectations and reached out to open it. A burst of bronze light flashed, and a fist-sized pocket made of coarse cloth appeared inside. Ding, you have opened a 1-star treasure chest and obtained a resource bag. Resource bag, there are 500 units of stone materials inside. The resource bag will automatically be destroyed after opening. Richard was mentally prepared, so there was nothing to be disappointed about. Moreover, 500 units of resources could be used to purchase a troop lair. This unexpected wealth was a profit no matter what. He reached out his hand and opened it. A light flashed and the resource bag shattered into pieces. 500 units of stone appeared on his attribute panel. Ads by Pub Future. After the harvest, Richard glanced at a few long-armed laborers who were eagerly looking at him. He couldn't help but laugh. He pointed at the laborers who had just discovered the treasure chest. "You have done well. You will receive my reward for your meritorious service. I have appointed you as the person in charge of the iron mine. You will be responsible for the mining of the iron mine, and at the same time, you will be responsible for the management of the other workers in the iron mine." The laborer who had been promoted was so excited that he was dancing with joy. "Ha ha ha ha, thank you for your gift, great lord. I will surely work hard for you." Ding, your order has greatly increased the enthusiasm of the long-armed laborer. His subordinates under his command will have their mining efficiency increased by 20% for 3 days. Richard laughed. These guys were really easy to fool. After confirming that there was nothing else in the iron mine, he left 10 laborers to mine the iron mine. He brought the mummy and the last 3 laborers back to his territory. The afternoon weather was too hot, and Richard's physical strength had decreased by a lot. He pursed his somewhat dry lips. "I was careless. I didn't bring water when I went out." With the special growth talent of the Desert Lord, his consumption in the desert had been greatly reduced. Even so, his mouth and tongue were still dry after this round. Needless to say, the few laborers had already dried their lips and were bleeding. With a slight thirst for water, Richard and the others unconsciously quickened their pace. The desert was always vast and desolate. It was already rare to see a few cactuses or a few stubbornly growing shuttle trees from afar. However, accidents often happened around the corner. "Lord, there are monsters there." Just as they climbed over a sand dune, a few laborers suddenly shouted with a hint of fear in their voices. Richard stopped in his tracks and looked forward. 200 to 300 meters away, near a cluster of shuttle trees, there were more than 20 grey wolves, which were as big as calves, enjoying the shade. No one could doubt how fierce these wild beasts would be once they went crazy. Although Richard did not get close, the wild beasts still made him feel a lot of pressure by relying on their exaggerated size. Desert Wolf. Level 3. Potential, Elite 3-star. Skills, Pounce, E rank, able to burst out powerful strength to pounce on enemies. Bite, E rank, sharp teeth, able to cause piercing damage. Racial talent, extremely agile. Fetters, when the Desert Wolf number is greater than 10, strength increases by 5%, and agility increases by 10%. When the Desert Wolf number is greater than 20, strength increases by 10%, and agility increases by 20%, activated. Description, OU tilde, Level 3, Elite 3-star Field Protectors. And there were as many as 25 of them. Richard's pupils constricted. It was not something that normal soldiers in the resource points could compare. Although the mummy was also an Elite 3-star, its level lagged behind the opponent. The mummies were still lacking a small team. If they were to forcefully charge, it would be a little risky. However, Richard was not willing to retreat just like that. He gazed at the mummy's stats: body of death, corpse bandage, sharp claw tearing, and sand transformation. The mummy's skills did not have much advantage against the Desert Wolf. The Desert Wolf was too agile. Only the sand transformation skill that it obtained was different. It meant immunity to 99% physical damage. This skill allowed the mummy to occupy a strong position from its weak position. Moreover, it was easier for the enemy to get infected with the plague after the sand transformation. When they were fighting the gnolls earlier, this combination had a powerful effect. Richard took a look. At this time, all the mummy's sand transformation skills had already recovered. Although the sand transformation skill is a bug, if we were to face the opponents head-on, the Desert Wolves are too agile. We might not be able to make much progress. Is there any way to restrict the Desert Wolves' movements? No, there's no need to restrict their movements. They just need to be slowed down. The mummy's plague can reduce their attributes by 20%. It's completely possible to do that. Then, Is there any way to infect the desert wolves with the plague before the battle? While looking at the desert wolves resting on the sand, Richard suddenly had a thought. He turned his head to look at the mummy closest to him. Immediately used the sand transformation to melt into the desert. The commanded mummy had a faint yellow sand glow on his body. Then the mummy's entire body immediately turned into a blurry image formed by countless grains of sand, and the bandage also turned dark yellow. Under Richard's gaze, the ground began to sag. The mummy's body that had turned into sand gradually merged into the yellow sand. Eventually, its entire body disappeared without a trace, leaving only an inconspicuous mark on the ground. Ha ha ha, that's surely good. Richard was in a great mood. He looked at the desert wild wolves while still lying under the shuttle tree. The plan worked. In the afternoon, the hot weather made the desert wolves immensely lazy, and they were not in a hurry to hunt. After dark, it was time for Richard's troop to attack. While they were lying down in a daze, the desert wolves suddenly felt a rustling sound coming from the ground. It seemed that something was underground. However, most did not pay much attention to it and continued to lie down. Only a few stood up slightly and lowered their heads to sniff with their wet noses. However, the things on the ground were blocked by the yellow sand. So, they could not smell anything. The movement continued for a while, and the desert wolves lost their vigilance and laid back lazily on the ground. Whoosh! At this moment, the ground suddenly shook, and countless yellow sand rose. The more than 10 desert wolves lying on the ground only felt a pain in their abdomen, and their physical strength rapidly declined. Blood splattered on the sand and was all over the ground. After the sand absorbed the blood, it condensed into a ball. Roar! The desert wolves let out an extremely painful roar from their throats. It bounced up from the ground like a spring. Of the 25 desert wolves, 12 had sharp claw marks on their abdomen. Only 2 were fast enough to escape. Only then did the desert wolves see what had attacked them. The posture of the mummy crawling up from the ground made the desert wolves almost go crazy. They immediately launched a fierce attack on the mummy that had crawled up from the ground. Those severely injured did not retreat at all. However, to their surprise, their sharp claws that could tear apart the bison just shortly penetrated when they hit this undead creature, rustling. It was as if they had pierced through the sand. The fierce launched attacks by the 25 desert wolves at the same time did not cause any damage to the mummy. On the contrary, as long as the desert wolves pierced through a mummy's body, their bodies would turn blue after a few breaths. The mummy's curse could reduce all the enemy's attributes by 20%. The aura of the desert wolves immediately weakened. If the mummy is normal, even if it could kill these desert wolves, the mummy would suffer severe losses. Unfortunately, their enemy was the mummy whom Richard gave the ability to turn into sand. After turning into sand, the mummy was an unkillable existence. No matter how the desert wolves tore at it, the mummy's body would always recover quickly. It was like using a knife to cut through quicksand, but pulling out the knife would leave no mark. Instead, after the mummy got up from the ground, it faced a group of cursed enemies and started a crazed killing mode. It didn't know fear, didn't know pain, and it only knew to launch an attack. Trading injuries for injuries with a wave of its sharp claws, the mummy constantly achieved results. After the mummy came out from the yellow sand, 3 or 4 desert wolves surrounded it and attacked it. In a few rounds, it could kill a desert wolf. Although the desert wolf fought back frantically, it was helpless against a group of enemies who had activated their invincibility skill. The battle ended before the mummy's sand transformation skill duration ended. The last desert wolf was drowned by more than 10 mummies. The body of the desert wolf was almost covered in scars, and fresh blood was flowing out. Ding, the army you have led has annihilated a group of desert wolves and obtained victory in a small-scale battle. You have obtained 50 experience points. Level 2, 51 thousandths. The elite level troops each provided 2 experience points. The rewards were not bad. However, the experience gained from leveling up to level 3 was 10 times more than before. The progress of leveling up slowed down instantly. However, what made Richard happy was still to come. Ding, bandaged mummies have experienced a lot of battles. Their levels have increased. After the system notification sounded, the aura of the 14 bandaged mummies suddenly increased by a huge amount. At the same time, the scars left behind had also returned to normal. Even the sand transformation skill that he had just used had refreshed. Richard was in a great mood. This was a bloody good win. And the main gains were not just these. He looked at the corpses of the desert wolves lying on the ground. Weren't the calves of these desert wolves good meat? For Twilight City, which lacked food, this was a resource that made people drool. However, the problem was that the corpses infected with the plague were deadly. Richard thought for a moment and turned at the mummy beside him. His eyes were filled with anticipation. "Can you remove the plague from the corpses of the wild wolves?" The mummy in front of him was stunned. It seemed like it had never done this before. After hesitating for a moment, the mummy slowly walked forward and pressed its hand to the wound on the wild wolf's corpse. A moment later, a blue curse on the desert wolf's skin seemed to come alive and began to move towards the direction where the mummy was pressing on the wound. After more than 10 breaths, the blue light completely disappeared. Clearly, the wild wolf's corpse had returned to normal. Richard's eyes were filled with surprise. Mummies were treasure troves. Blood money, blood money.